Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 7, which is our last chapter before the midterm. This week, we are going to be talking about behavioral views of learning. And before we launch into that, let's go ahead and cover the objectives for this unit. So there are a bunch, as always, or almost always. They are to be able to define learning from a behavioral perspective, to define contiguity, to be able to differentiate between the antecedent and the behavior, to be able to understand the differences between classical conditioning and operant conditioning, to be able to explain operant conditioning, particularly the differences and similarities between positive and negative reinforcement, to be able to use the knowledge of operant conditioning to explain behavior in scenarios, and then lastly, to be able to apply behavioral approaches to modifying behavior using contingency contracts, token reinforcement, group consequences, and the appropriate use of punishment, etc. I will leave that to you to cover in Woolfolk. Obviously, as future educators, that material is quite important. However, in a general just overview of Ed Psych, it's not necessary for me to go into that detail for you, although I think it's certainly something that you should be aware of from this course. So go ahead and take a look at that, and we will flow through these first 6 today during this lecture. Okay, and then one more thing before we get started, and some of you have already caught on to this, but if you have not, I would strongly encourage that you take a look at what Woolfolk is providing you, in fact, what any textbook writer is providing you, or textbook author rather. And so she gives you an outline of every chapter, and in addition to that, she provides key terms. So key terms, and there are so many in this course. So what I did here is I put in red the key terms that are most important from this chapter. And what I would encourage you to do is to try to identify these key terms within the key terms. So when you watch my lectures, when you look at the videos that I provided, when you just do a run through and kind of look at general patterns in the textbook, you should be able to start keying in on what's truly important in the key terms. So I just wanted to point that out. I would stay away from doing things like writing all of these out with definitions. You're just going to be killing yourself with work and probably not getting a lot from it. So I did want to point out that they're there. They are useful to an extent, but please be thoughtful in how you approach your use of them. So the terms cover specific parts of the textbooks, from the subheading Early Explanations of Learning, Contiguity, and Classical Conditioning, to Contemporary Applications, to Functional Behavioral Assessment, Positive Behavioral Supports, and Self-Management. So that's where they're coming from, and that's why I kind of tweaked or pulled these out. Okay, so let's start with this idea of what the heck is the behavioral view of learning anyway, and what is behavioralism? So a lot of times there are assumptions about what students know, and I like to be very careful and make sure that we actually understand what we're talking about when a term is used. So behavioralism is basically behavioral psychology, and it's the study of external behavior, or how people behave. Pretty simple. So why do we do it? Well, for one thing, it's easy to do. Behavior is objective and it's observable, so we can see what happens. Whereas what happens in someone's mind is really difficult, and it's so hard to measure. So the mind is kind of like a black box. It's really difficult to find and really difficult to dig into. There's so much that goes into the human mind. It's much, much easier to just think about, well, let's look at someone's behavior, and then I can make some assumptions about how they think based on their behavior. Behavior, in essence, is the response of an organism, so any living thing is an organism, to stimuli. So a stimuli is some event that happens. So for example, we have the cute little puppy here. who is responding to his master saying, no, bad dog, right? So I'm going to stop. I know master is mad. So what does this all mean in terms of the behavioral view of learning? In the behavioral view of learning, learning is changes in behavior. That's all it amounts to. So learning is changes in behavior. We know it's more than that. So we're going to take a look at the behavioral view in this chapter, and then after the exam, we will delve into some other areas that I think might be more meaningful and in-depth for some of you, but definitely there's a huge basis for understanding behavior through learning or vice versa. Okay, so let's start with this term contiguity, which is the second bullet that we had. This is something that you need to have a handle on, and contiguity is actually pretty simple. Contiguity is whenever two or more whenever two or more sensations occur together often enough, they will become associated. So you may have heard the term association in the past. So contiguity we could consider to be a synonym with association. And here are some examples. So I have this image of Uncle Sam, who has become synonymous with the message, "We want you," for the U.S. military. So the image and the message were widely used during World War II. This example demonstrates an icon or an image becomes associated with something else. Some other examples, so one from everyday life, eggs and bacon are associated with breakfast, hand gestures with certain messages, so we wave hello or we wave goodbye, and other hand gestures we know send other messages. So two things become associated if they occur together often enough. That's contiguity. An example from psychology would be a baseball player wearing a certain pair of socks on the day he hits 3 home runs, and then he associates wearing the socks and hitting home runs. So it would have to continue to happen for contiguity to actually be in play. So he wears these certain socks the first time, and so he's like, oh, that was lucky, so I'm going to do it again, and he continues to do that. An example from educational psychology, a student makes a good grade on a test after trying a new study method, and then does it again over and over in time, and eventually they make an association between the stimulus of studying and the response of getting a good grade. So that's contiguity. Like I said, pretty simple. It's just if two things occur together often enough, they will become associated. From there, we can move to classical conditioning. And this everything that we cover in this chapter has to do with contiguity. So we need to have that basis of understanding that two things can become associated. And like I said, that's pretty easy to understand. We can certainly think of examples from our own life. That being said, classical conditioning focuses on the learning of involuntary emotional or psychological responses such as fear, increased muscle tension, salivation, or sweating to an external stimuli. So something happens and then we have this reaction. It is very important that you key in on this idea that in classical conditioning, it's involuntary. So all of these things that are listed here from Woolfolk's definition, fear, muscle tension, salivation, or sweating, we don't control those things. Those things happen. They're a response to something else. So the most widely used example of classical conditioning is Pavlov's dog. So Pavlov taught his dog to salivatate every time he heard a bell. So how he did this is, in the beginning, there was no association between the bell and eating, but he started to ring the bell and give the dog food. And so ultimately, over time, the dog associated the ringing of the bell with food. And so after a while, Pavlov took away the food, but the dog would still salivatate. So in his mind, ringing of the bell, food, ringing of the bell, food. So again, contiguity has to do with making an association over time. And so most of you have probably heard of Pavlov's dogs. If you haven't, that's my little breakdown of it. If you have questions about it, you can definitely contact me, but it is also covered in Woolfolk. And again, I don't feel like it's particularly difficult to understand, but sometimes students have questions that I don't foresee. Here are some examples of classical conditioning from everyday, or here is an example of classical conditioning from everyday life. So we eat a food such as cooked carrots and become sick. And from then on, we see cooked carrots and feel nauseous. It's actually pretty easy for us to make food associations this strongly. That has to do with our drive to survive. But in true essence, if it was truly classical conditioning, it would have to happen over and over again. Here's an example from educational psychology. If a student is bullied at school, they could come to associate anxiety and fear with school. And so this is actually one of the tip-offs that we espouse for identifying bullying behavior, that we would see that a child is feeling fear and anxiety about going to school. And so we know something's probably wrong. They're making an association between school and something that's fearful, and school really shouldn't be like that. Learning should be fun to a certain extent. Here's another example. If a teacher embarrasses a student over a math error and brings them to tears, for example, the student could come to associate the subject of math with anxiety. So what happens for some students is they develop fears of certain subjects because they don't do very well in them. There are a lot of factors that play into that. Certainly math anxiety or math phobia is fairly commonplace within our society, which is unfortunate. And we can blame it on our past teachers. Just kidding. We can't totally blame them, but we do know that there could be situations where this is happening. In fact, I had some experiences like this in my own life, and I'm still not a math person, although I don't think that I ever will be, and probably wasn't from the very beginning. All right, so there are 3 basic guidelines for working with classical conditioning in the classroom. So again, remember that classical conditioning involves a response that is involuntary, and you're going to know why I'm hounding on that when we get to operant conditioning in just a second. So the 3 basic guidelines are to associate positive, pleasant events with learning tasks. Well, we certainly don't want students to feel that learning is bad, or learning is fearful, or learning is too difficult. So we want to make positive associations. That makes sense. 2, we can help students to participate in anxiety-producing situations voluntarily and successfully. So if you have a student, for example, who is very shy and doesn't want to do public speaking, you take steps to gradually introduce them to the task and keep working with them on it. So it really, you're kind of lowering the level of risk. The amount of anxiety is reduced, and so then over time they can start to feel that maybe it's pleasant enough to be something that they can do. And then lastly, we can help students recognize differences and similarities among situations so they can discriminate and generalize appropriately. Okay, we are moving on. So we talked about classical conditioning as having involuntary responses. Well, with operant conditioning, we have voluntary behavior. So, Woolfolk's definition of operant conditioning, and just if you're wondering, that G7 means it's coming from the glossary. Operant conditioning is learning in which voluntary behavior is strengthened or weakened by consequences, which are results from behavior, or antecedents, which are events or proceedings before the event. So what I wanted to do there is just make sure that you understand that antecedents happen before. Okay, so over on the right, we have, for some of you that are quite familiar with B.F. Skinner from psychology, that image should be fairly humorous. So it's a pigeon who will peck for food, and it has to do with B.F. Skinner's work on pigeons. So B.F. Skinner was able to demonstrate that pigeons could be taught to peck, to have food released only when a certain colored light was on. So Skinner was actually reacting to classical conditioning as he felt that it only explained half the story. And that environment and context also has importance in learning. So operant conditioning is voluntary behavior, which is different than just having a reaction to something. Examples from everyday life are having a job and going to work every day to receive a paycheck. Receiving praise after a musical performance would increase the amount you perform. So you go to work to get the job, to get the money. We go to work to get the money for the job. An example from psychology of operant conditioning is at a store, a child throws a tantrum because he did not get a candy bar. Dad finally gets him one. Dad starts buying candy bars whenever they go to the store. So interesting thing about this one, it's dad that's being conditioned. And that happens. Children teach their parents just as much as parents teach the child. So it is important that you recognize this as you go through life. And an example from educational psychology. A teacher exempts a student from the final test if they have perfect attendance. So what has the teacher taught the student to do? And is that the right lesson? Okay. So operant conditioning continued. With operant conditioning, we typically associate operant conditioning with reinforcement. So again, continuity can only be developed over time. So typically, we have a behavior and a consequence and an effect. So behavior, we have a reinforcement, and the effect is it's either strengthened or repeated behavior. So if we get something that's good, or something negative is taken away, then we have reinforcement. So reinforcement is the use of consequences to reinforce behavior. There are two types. There's positive reinforcement. So this is when a behavior produces a new response, a new stimuli. So something is added. It's positive. Positive reinforcement is when something is added. Negative reinforcement is when a behavior produces the elimination of an unpleasant or negative stimuli, and that strengthens the behavior. So there's something that we want to go away. And when that goes away, we get negative reinforcement. And that's super important. So I have posted this little quiz on Icon. But decide whether the following provide positive or negative reinforcement based on consequence and effect. So a loud buzz in some cars when the ignition is turned on, feigning a stomach ache in order to avoid school. So again, what I'm wanting you to think about here is whether something is being added, which is positive reinforcement, or something is being taken away, which is negative reinforcement. Rushing home in the winter to get out of the cold, fanning oneself to escape from the heat, et cetera, et cetera. So again, you can work through these on Icon. If you were taking the face-to-face course, we'd work through this together, but since it would either be me providing you the answers without allowing you to think through it, or nothing. So I tried to find a balance. Presented it to you. You do have that available to you on Icon, and I do encourage you to work through those, as well as all of the quizzes that I provide for you. So they are quite helpful. Okay, so again, reinforcement and punishment are not synonyms. Reinforcement encourages behavior. Punishment actually decreases behavior. So reinforcement is done when we want something, we want the behavior to increase. Punishment is when we want the behavior to stop. Okay, so my little chart here, I have my positives and my negatives. So positive reinforcement and positive punishment both add something, so they're positives, right? So that's kind of the first question that you want to ask. Is it positive or negative? Is something being added or something being taken away? So added, positive, negative, something's going away. So positive reinforcement, the consequence adds something. Future likelihood of behavior increases. Here's an example. Students studied for tests. As a consequence, they got an A+. The impact is they will study for the next test. Hoping this happens for all of you. An example of positive punishment is the consequence adds something and the future likelihood of the behavior decreases. Here's the example. The behavior is person attempted the half pipe. Consequence, they sustained a head injury. The impact, they realize they're too old for this, too old for skateboarding, and they won't try it again. Okay, so punishment is actually something that decreases the behavior. All right, moving on. Negative reinforcement, consequence removes something, the future likelihood of the behavior increases. Here's an example. The behavior was you took out the trash and the foul smell in the house went away. The impact is you will continue to discard smelly trash. Okay? Something's being taken away, smelly trash. A negative punishment, consequence removes something. The future likelihood of the behavior decreases. So here's the behavior. You're driving recklessly. You have your license taken away. Therefore, you are less likely to drive recklessly in the future because it's a pain. Okay, so one last slide on this. I know I'm beating it to death, and I'm doing it for a reason because students quite frequently get this confused, and I want that to not happen for any of you. Okay, so in this chart is very similar to what we just looked at, but the colors help us see that the positive, the green, adds something to the individual behavior where negative, red, removes. And so there's both positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. The questions to ask yourself are, do we want the behavior to increase or decrease? If we want it to increase, it must be a reinforcement. Are we adding something? The next question is, are we adding something or removing it? And if we're removing it, then it's negative. If we're adding something, it's a positive. So simple way to keep it straight. Ask the two questions. Okay, so we have been talking about this idea of making association. In order to do this, there needs to be some kind of reinforcement. So it happens over time, and we're just going to briefly run through the different types of schedules. So how often it happens and the consequences of how often it happens. Okay, so one schedule is a continuous reinforcement. So every time it happens, there's a reinforcement after each response. So some examples would be turning on the television. Every time we turn on the television, we get to watch a show. Buying soda from a vending machine. We get it every single time. Well, almost every single time. The response pattern. So what we learn, we rapidly learn that this will happen. However, when the reinforcement stops, there's very little persistence. So if I put my coins into the vending machine and I don't get a pop, I'm not buying from that vending machine anymore. So the response disappears quite quickly. Again, so using the television, if I push my on button and nothing happens, I stop watching the television. Okay, second type of schedule is a fixed interval schedule. So this is reinforcement that happens after a set period of time. So every fourth time you might get the reinforcement. Some examples: studying as a weekly quiz approaches, dishwashing cycle, dishes are clean after a specified period of time. So here's what happens. The response rate increases as the time for reinforcement approaches. If we only have a quiz every 2 weeks, we probably don't study on the week that we don't have a quiz. And then it drops after reinforcement. Think about that. You probably do this, at least in terms of the quizzes. So the reaction when the reinforcement stops, there's little persistence. The response disappears, again, just as it does with the continuous schedule, the response disappears quickly when time for reinforcement passes and no reinforcement appears. So it's that expectation level is pretty high. And so when it's gone, it's like, oh, don't care about it anymore. So here's the third type of schedule, which is a variable interval schedule. So this is reinforcement after varying lengths of time. So we're not sure when it's going to happen. Some examples might be pop quizzes or texting. So we don't know when we're going to get the response to the text. So the response pattern is a slow, steady rate of responding and very little pause after reinforcement. So interestingly enough, this variability actually provides greater persistence when the reinforcement stops. So there's a slow decline in response rate because we don't know when we didn't know when it was going to happen, so we're slower to react to the fact that it didn't happen. If that makes some, I hope that makes some sense. If not, again, email me, let me know. I'll say it again. Oh, I will say it in a different way. So the fourth type is a fixed ratio, is reinforcement after a set number of responses. So this is different than the fixed interval. So interval has to do with time, fixed ratio has to do with a quantity. So after a set number of responses. Here's an example: a telemarketer gets a bonus after 100 credit cards are enrolled, or a bake sale is another example of a fixed ratio. So the response pattern is a rapid response rate, pause after reinforcement, reaction when the reinforcement stops, there's little persistence, rapid drop in response rate when an expected number of responses are given. So we figured out the pattern, and if we don't get the pattern, we don't get the payoff, then we don't do it anymore. So if the telemarketer doesn't get a bonus, I don't care about it anymore. The motivation goes away, and it's this kind of setting that high level of expectation, and then you take it away, well, my motivation's gone. It's very interesting psychologically. All right, and then in counter to the fixed ratio, we have a variable ratio, and this is reinforcement after a varying number of responses. An example would be slot machines. So the response pattern is a very high response rate, little pause after reinforcement, so keep doing it. So, interestingly enough, the reaction when the reinforcement stops, it has the greatest persistence. Response rate stays high and gradually drops off. So again, it's just not knowing. So we're not sure how to respond, so we don't respond, and we keep thinking it's going to happen. The hope is there. So those are the 5 types of reinforcement schedules and their ultimate results. So what it's really telling us is anything that has a pattern. So continuous, obviously, not great. And then the fixed intervals, or the fixed intervals and fixed ratios are not great because they're patterns that people figure out, and then when they don't get the reward, they don't want it anymore. So the variables actually have the greatest potential. Okay. So some guidelines for using praise as operant conditioning. Be clear and direct in giving praise. So students need to know why you're praising them. It's kind of like if I praise my dog 20 minutes after he ate his food, he doesn't care. He doesn't know why he's getting praised. We need it tied. Praise should be appreciative, not evaluative. Horrible word. So praise in and of itself has to just be positive, not to have this critical quality to it. Standards should be based on the individual. So what are they capable of? So I give praise to students as appropriate. We should attribute success to effort and ability. Praise should reinforce, and it should recognize genuine accomplishment. Okay. So within the classroom, there are some things that happen quite often in relation to behavior. One of them is students want to gain attention. So you have attention seekers. We have students that have maybe a lack of attention at home, and so they seek attention wherever they can get it. So they're looking to fill an insecurity, which is a sad state of affairs, but it's going to disrupt your classroom. So frequently, teachers will give it to them. So a student acts out, and then we give them attention. So what we're actually doing is we're giving them positive reinforcement. They're gaining the attention that they were seeking. It's not what we want. So there have been times when I've taught where I've had to just ignore a student's behavior there. And there's a line, definitely. There's a line where you just have to respond because it's too much. But I've had students that just speak out of turn, and it's your instinct is to address it, but sometimes the best response is no response. Okay, so other examples are student wants something tangible, an object, activity, or event. And I thought about this a lot last year. I was doing some volunteering at City High. And I had a student that I was working with who always wanted to watch a video. She really liked Chucky. That was her thing. She just wanted to watch Chucky videos. Developmental student, so not exactly working at full capacity, but good person nonetheless. But what happened was she always wanted to watch the video, and so in order to watch the video, she had to have her homework done. So she would rush through the homework to get it done in order to have the time during class to watch the video. So we can give positive reinforcement where we're actually promoting a negative behavior, rushing through the homework. Other examples are gaining sensory stimulations, visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, kinesthetic, etc. So just, we can reinforce, this happens sometimes, some parents reinforce with food. Their child gets positive reinforcement, but there are some consequences to that we don't really want. Other examples, we have some students that want to escape from attention, some students that are naturally shy, other students just are withdrawn. So if we allow this to happen, we're giving them negative reinforcement. So somewhere, somehow, we have to balance their desire to escape from attention with our need to have them participate. So if we allow a student to go out in the hall, for example, if we allow a student to continue to be silent, they're going to continue that behavior. So somewhere, somehow, we have to draw them out. Another example would be escape from a demanding or boring task. So if we say, oh, you don't have to do that, then we've provided negative reinforcement, where we've allowed the student to discontinue doing the boring task, and so they'll continue to not want to do it. Well, sometimes learning is slow and effortful, and we have to do boring stuff in order to learn. But learning can also be quite fun, and it's just, we need to be thoughtful in how we approach student behavior. And then the last is an escape from sensory stimulation. So I don't have a very good example of that one. But again, it's this idea that they want to get away from it, and then we let them get away from that stimulation, and the next thing we know, we have basically conditioned them to do the same thing over and over again. So the negative reinforcement, rewarding student by changing the stimuli will increase the future likelihood. Okay. So last note on this chapter is we are going to, after the exam, make a crossover into social learning theory. But it is important to note that this gentleman, Albert Bandura, who is huge in educational psychology, is still working. He's at Stanford. He's Canadian, but hey, we'll try to overlook it. He wanted to point out the limitations of traditional views of behavioral learning. So both classical and operant conditioning have their limitations, and he thought that there was more to learning or different types of learning that we could look into. And so when you're done with the exam, and I am giving you a week off that week of the exam, so no discussions, no reading, it's just you, your textbook, my videos, the quizzes, whatever you need to get yourself prepared. When we come back, we're going to pick up with Bandura. So just wanted to give you a heads up on that. Again, if you're watching this close to the exam, one, good luck with the studying. If you have problems, questions, anything that you want to recap, let me know. And then good luck with the exam. Thanks.